we're trained out of our paying attention to our body's cues. A lot of times it's just because of diet culture. We almost build this idea in our minds that it's more morally sound and virtuous if we can override our hunger, if we can have a glass of water instead of eating a meal, if we can push off breakfast a little bit further, if we don't succumb, quote unquote, to our hunger cues, then we are somehow more powerful. We are better. So we almost train ourselves out of listening to hunger cues. What is going on? Welcome to today's episode of Conquer the Day. I am your host, Lindsay Pickowitz.
And I am your host, Brian Pickowitz.
Today we're going to be teaching you one of the most valuable skills that you can learn and really relearn when you are trying to build a healthy life. And that is how to be in tune with your body's hunger and fullness cues. Mm-hmm. We'll talk about this later, but hunger and fullness cues are absolutely essential if you want to live a healthy life, because you don't need to track your food for the rest of your life. You don't need to lose weight for the rest of your life. Ideally, you get to a point where you can make progress that you want, but then just maintain it, right? That's the dream. And how you do that is really getting in tune with your body again.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk to you about hunger and fullness cues, because this is really about learning the language of your body. Now, here's what's fascinating. If you think about learning a language, I don't know if you've ever learned a language that's not native to you, but if you learn a language at one point and then you stop speaking it, you actually really struggle to speak it again, right? I remember
you lose it.
If you don't use it, you lose it. And I remember learning language. I learned Spanish in college, and I got really great at speaking it. I got to the point where I could sell, because I was in a sales job. I could sell in Spanish to people who were looking for clothes or supplements, and I felt really proud of myself because I was able to communicate so effectively. But it's been almost 10 years since I spoke Spanish fluently, and if I'm being honest, my ability to retain that information is very, very low. And so you got to think of the same thing when it comes to understanding the language of your body, understanding what it's trying to tell you. And if you've never trained that ear, if you've never trained that skill, if you haven't really tuned into what your body's telling you naturally or seen it as a sign, right? Sometimes we can identify that my body is full, but that's not necessarily connected to, oh, that means I should stop eating. Right. So if we haven't tuned into what the body's saying, well, then how are we going to know when to stop eating or when to start eating? Or we might make mistakes, right? We might mistake a cue that's not really a cue, or we might say, oh, well, that means something else. So the point is, by learning this skill and learning the language of your body, you're actually getting to the point where you can take that skill or that language to any season of your life. So you can take it on vacation, you could take it while you're traveling, or you're at a restaurant, or it's the holidays and you don't want to overeat. And that's our ultimate goal, is to get to that point where we have a sense of what's known as interoception, the ability to observe our body, what it's telling us, and then using that information to inform our actions. Now, why this podcast? Why this episode? Well, one of the things we love to do is help people. And so we were helping one of our clients, for Lindsay and I at the Fitness Project, we help business owners and career-focused professionals get in shape and build a healthy life. We believe that when you're healthy, it improves everything that you do. And one of our clients, successful business owner, he was talking about, man, I've struggled with fitness and health my whole life. It's been such a challenge. I'll drop a bunch of weight and then I'll gain it back. Just a typical example of diet history, right? So extensive diet history, good and bad food, a lot of labels, and not a lot of awareness of his body. And so I was coaching him and I said, hey, man, I just need you to start doing X, Y, Z. And then one of the things I tied it down with is and also observe your fullness cues and your hunger cues. And he said, what is that? I've never heard of that. And so that was great, because it meant I could teach him and I could educate him and I could give him feedback. But we know that if someone has a problem in one area, it's usually that other people probably have that same challenge. So giving you this to build off of last week's podcast, if you can start to learn this language, it's going to change your life.
Yeah. And because we've already talked about why it's important, I don't think we need to discuss that further. It's important because your body is built with natural hunger cues. And fullness cues. Your body is built to maintain itself, maintain its body weight, maintain its energy balance, and that's what your hunger cues are really for. And they're regulated by hormones in your body called leptin and ghrelin. So there's this whole system that each individual is built with that we tend to just get trained out of being mindful of, right? We're not necessarily taught, okay, you're starting to get hungry. Like even as kids, I wasn't really taught that. Like I only knew when I was starving or when I was like way over full. And those were the only two things that I really had awareness of. So it's just kind of giving yourself a little bit of grace and seeing that there's actually a lot of different little cues that are already in place for every single human that if you can learn how to listen to, you will be able to follow accordingly. And therefore either make progress or just feel generally healthy or maintain any weight loss that you've gained over time. So we're going to break this down into 5 different hunger cues that you can start to pay attention to. Think of these as cues that have different levels of intensity from like 0 to 10. And that will come into play later when we say, how do you apply this? How do you start learning? And then your fullness cues. We're going to break down 5 different fullness cues that you can start to pay attention to and slow your roll so that you don't get to the point where you are overeating and gaining weight. This is super, super, super important. So turn on, tune in, and let's get started.
Before we get there, Linz, why might we not be able to observe our hunger cues? Why might we not be able to observe our fullness cues? Because I think that actually pulls together an important factor when you talk about building this awareness or building this language and maybe some of the signs that people might have around it.
Good point. So I would say the biggest thing is when I say we've been trained out of it, I guess I'll specify. We're trained out of our paying attention to our body's cues. A lot of times it's just because of diet culture and feeling like this is really interesting. You may agree or disagree, but we almost build this idea in our minds that it's more morally sound and virtuous if we can override our hunger, for one. If we can have a glass of water instead of eating a meal. If we can push off breakfast a little bit further. If we don't succumb, quote unquote, to our hunger cues, then we are somehow more powerful. We are better, right? So we almost train ourselves out of listening to hunger cues. On the other side of that spectrum, we completely ignore fullness cues, usually associated with play and pleasure and joy. Sometimes it's with other things, but I think the positive side and why we've trained ourselves out of it is because we grow up with things like the clean plate club, right? Like our parents are like, hey, finish your food. And then we have the reinforcement of holidays and vacations and special occasions where the goal is eat as much as you can because this type of food is something you only get once a year.
Yeah, and we don't talk often about relationship with food in our society. And your relationship with food is oftentimes like your relationship with money. If you grew up with, let's say I came from a background where when my dad got really sick, we didn't have a lot of money. And so everything was really scarce. That became a belief system about money that I had to break. And so when food's scarce, well, then that becomes a belief system that we aren't aware of, right? It becomes something that's unconscious. And so when you think of your relationship with food, it's really how do you think about food? How do you approach food? What is your mindset around food? And also, do you look at certain foods like they're good and bad? Do you look at certain foods like, oh, I can only eat it today because I'm cheating, right? And that becomes something that pushes us to have, let's say, lack of awareness around our fullness cues. Like we can all imagine, I mean, I've been there myself, where I'm going to have this food today. I'm going to have a pizza today. And so even though I've eaten 4 slices, I'm pretty full, like, but there's a 5th slice and man, if I just eat it today, I don't have to worry. Then it'll be gone, and I don't have to worry. Yeah, I'll put
That's on. That's a good one too.
You know what I mean? So we have these other elements that show up when it's like, oh, we might even be aware of our hunger cues. We might even be aware of our fullness cues, but there's something that's overriding it. It's usually a belief or a thought,
or
a habit, and so you can start to see how. We're all human. We all make these choices. We all do it. It's not a punishment or a mission of guilt if that's where you're at. But I think what's also really important is understanding when it's cyclical.
Yep.
When it's just a cycle of I don't eat food, I think that I have to restrict, but then I have a late night snack and then I screw up my diet.
Yeah.
It's being able to start building awareness around how we're approaching food so that we can get to the other side. right? It's like, yeah, you can still have a slice of pizza. You can still have times where you're like, man, like, I'll tell you one thing. When my mom makes eclair cake on Thanksgiving, I am going to eat so much of it that no one else is going to be able to touch it because, like, it's my favorite food. So I'll probably have like 3 or 4 slices of it, and I will not feel bad about it. Doesn't mean that I'm a failure. It doesn't mean I'm unhealthy. It's just like, oh, that food, she only makes it once a year, and it's such a gift, right? So it's being able to understand, like, how can we build awareness in our regular life?
Yeah.
And how can we practice this daily? And then, hey, if we're going to go on vacation, you're going to go to Italy, enjoy yourself, but then come back to the habit.
Yeah.
Or don't make the vacation worse by overeating or overdoing it.
Yeah, well, the key is the cyclical effect, because what
Yes.
you just said could sound like it's in conflict with what we had shared at the beginning, which is,
100%.
it's tied to pleasure. You overeat. You can overeat once or twice in your life and be completely fine and totally maintain your weight. It's not a big deal, but it's the cyclical effect that we want to avoid. And that's why becoming aware of your hunger and fullness cues is essential.
Can I tie it down in one piece?
Sure.
It's understanding what season you're in right now, too. If you're in a season where you're like, hey, I want to lose 20 pounds and then maintain from there, it's like, well, maybe you have to pay attention to the patterns that keep you from reaching that goal. And then you reach that 20-pound mark, and it's like, okay, now I'm going to maybe be more intuitive with my food and approach it in a more mindful way. But it's developing the skills while you're getting there. I think it's really important. And then that way you don't have to be as black and white.
So now that we have regrounded ourselves, let's talk about our hunger and fullness cues. Let's break it apart. And that way you can start to pick up on your body's language and develop that ear for it, as we said. Starting off, let's talk hunger cues. As we said at the beginning, there's 5 different hunger cues that you can start to pay attention to. They don't come in this order. This is not a hierarchy or first mover type of list. These are 5 different cues that you can pick up on, and they're going to be completely different depending on the person, depending on your sleep, how much you've had to drink, coffee, water, etc. That is really going to be what makes the difference. So just pay attention to all 5. See which ones you can pick up on. First thing, when it comes to hunger cues, this is our body's signal. Hey, I need nourishment now or soon. Depending on the severity of the cue, that's how you know how hungry you are. So again, think of this on a scale of 0 to 10. The first cue that you might pick up on, I experienced this one this morning, is a low growl or rumble, right? This is one that we are typically taught. When your stomach is rumbling, it's growling, you're hungry. But it's going to start as very, very subtle, and then it will get louder and more intense the longer that you wait to eat. So just that rumble is a signal that, hey, we need some nourishment soon. Second cue, telling us we are hungry, it's about time to eat, is a physical feeling of emptiness in our stomach. If we feel hollow, or as you've said in the past, you feel light, that's a signal that, okay, we might need nourishment soon. Right? And you can see how that one might be a little bit more subtle. You're probably going to feel that first thing in the morning for the first few hours, or you might end up feeling it if you have a long span of time between meals. That's your second cue. Your third cue is one that I think most of us will try to override or blame on emotion, but it actually is directly tied to hunger. Low energy and irritability. If you start to feel tired, you have like that midday crash, or you start to get really finicky and irritable and reactive, it's not just because of your emotions, most likely. It's also typically tied to food and lack of food. So the moment that you start to hit that low energy, your body might be saying, hey, I need at least a little something to keep my energy up, to keep going. So that's a good signal to have at least a snack, and you might not need a full meal. Again, depends on the severity of the cue. Fourth one, then fifth. Fourth one, if you have difficulty concentrating, that is a hunger cue. If you are working on something, and I describe this as, even though you're putting your full attention on it, you feel really slow, like your brain is just processing information slower. It's hard to concentrate. Maybe your eyesight gets a tiny bit fuzzy, or maybe you end up starting to want to task hop more. It is a hunger cue. Your body is saying, hey, I don't have the nourishment I need to really be fully dedicated to this task, and you can't focus. That's a hunger cue, believe it or not. And the last one, which I'm going to say put on more of the back burner, because this takes a lot of self-awareness to figure out if this is emotion or actually a hunger cue, and that is cravings for specific foods. Once you become really, really in tune with your body's hunger cues, you will notice that you crave really interesting foods. It's not just like, oh, I'm craving ice cream today, therefore I must have ice cream. No, no, no. You typically, if you're really in tune with your body, you'll crave the types of nutrients that you actually need. There was a period of my life where I craved avocados and salmon, and that was because my body needed more healthy fats. So, this is something that you learn over time, but if you have really strong cravings and you can't stop thinking about food, most likely you're hungry. And that would be maybe the better way to put it is if you can't stop thinking about food, you're probably actually a little bit hungry or you need nutrients of some kind.
Yeah, your body might be requesting certain nutrients rather than just sugar or
Right,
sweets
just
or
the
something like that.
specific food you're craving. That's really important. And what I'll tie this down with, I'm going to give an anecdote here because I think it'll be helpful. Learning how to eat before I was at a 10 out of 10 on the hunger scale is probably the most life-changing change that I made to my health. I started eating when I'm towards like a 4 or 5 on the hunger scale, and that has made all the difference in the world. I don't overeat. It's way easier to maintain my weight. I have a much healthier relationship with food. I have more energy. And although it was really uncomfortable at first because I had trained myself to believe I don't eat until I am hungry, even though it was uncomfortable, it made a massive difference in my health mentally and physically. So I'll give you that with hopes that you can do the same for yourself. And if you are somebody who's dedicated to intermittent fasting, by all means, go for it, do it. But if you're just trying to be healthy and you want to improve your relationship with food and overeating and undereating is really a struggle for you, start eating and when you're like a 4 out of 5, 4 or 5 out of 10. It's going to make a big difference. But that would be my last note on hunger cues.
Yeah, and the piece to tie down to is being able to learn when you're bored, you're stressed, you're anxious, you're excited, right? Being able to separate our emotions from our hunger is a really important factor to develop as well. And we'll talk more about that when it comes to mindful eating. Now, talking about fullness is the other side of the spectrum, right? Where we're typically listening to our body and it's telling us, hey, it's time to stop eating, right? Now, it's really easy to override this cue, right? We talked about it a little bit earlier. The food's there. It tastes delicious. It's our favorite food. Oh, I haven't had it in so long. Oh, it's my time of the week where I get to binge or I get to cheat, right? We have all these beliefs, and that allows us to override our fullness cue. But if you can listen to your fullness cues, it's actually it's your body's way of slowing you down and telling you, I have enough nutrients. Now, you'll start to notice that shows up from time to time in several different subtleties, but there's really 5 cues that we want to pay attention to. The first is a feeling of satisfaction or contentment. So if you're eating food, let's say I'll use a pizza because I love buffalo chicken pizza myself.
It's one of the hardest ones.
So yeah, because it's so great. But if I'm eating a pizza and let's say there's 8 slices, I usually find satisfaction around slice 3. Right, like slice 1 and 2.
And you're also a 215-pound man.
Yeah.
With lots of muscle.
Well, so the 3 slices, that's roughly, let's say, 600 calories. So I'm usually around a point where I get to the second slice, and I'm like, yeah, I feel pretty satisfied, and I feel pretty content. And between slice 2 and 3, that's when I hit that sense of satisfaction, contentment. And then the second cue is I slow my pace. Right, so you'll start to notice, when I feel my fullness come in, I start to slow my pace. Now, you'll notice that these are really hard when you're just eating sweets, right? So if you haven't eaten real food all day long and then you're eating sugar, there's no fiber, there's no protein, there's no water. Well, that's why your fullness cue doesn't kick in as much, right? So it's really easy to feel like, I ate a whole pound, or I could say a pound of sugar, right? You can see like a bag of candy or something like that, and you still didn't feel full. It's because there's no fiber, there's no water, there's no protein, right? So again, thinking of the pizza example, first thing I'm looking for, I start to feel satisfaction, I start to feel contentment. The second thing is my pace starts to slow. And then if I allow my body to slow, I can also feel a sense of fullness, right? So the third cue is that sense of fullness that comes from my stomach really expanding with the food that I'm putting into it. And you can usually feel this, like, you think of the feeling of like, oh, my pants get a little tighter, my belly almost expands. That's a normal feeling, right? That's a feeling of fullness that my body's starting to communicate with me. And if I can pay attention to it, that's going to tell me, hey, it's maybe time to stop eating right now. And that's okay. The fourth thing is a loss of interest. So if you're eating food and you lose interest in the food, like, I really don't want to eat the rest. I really don't need to eat the rest. That's a sign that your body's becoming full. And again, this is learning how to take leftovers home.
Yeah.
This is learning how to say, I really don't want to eat this right now. I can eat it later. And that takes discipline, that takes practice, but you can do it, right? And then last thing is a feeling of comfort, right? So you should get done a meal and feel comfortable. Feel like, that was a good meal. I ate enough. I feel satisfied. Versus when you push that boundary too far, if I try to go and have the fourth slice or the fifth slice, man, I actually leave the meal feeling uncomfortable. And never mind the emotional guilt. That's a totally different conversation. It's just my body feels like it overate.
Yeah.
And now you can think of the reason why it's starting to also take all that energy to digest the food, because more than what it needed. So these are 5 simple cues. Again, looking at your satisfaction and contentment, looking at how your body starts to slow down its eating pace, how you start to slow down your eating pace. That feeling of being full, the loss of interest in the food, and that feeling of comfort that comes after. If you can cue into this, it will help you identify when your body is reaching that point of satiation. And through some of the cues we're going to talk about in a moment, some of the practices of mindful eating, makes it really easy to identify and put this into practice and play.
Awesome. Now, as we wrap up our hunger and fullness cues here, I want to give you a little bit of affirmation on where to start by saying you already have started. Just by listening to this podcast, just by getting that full breakdown of the 10 cues that your body's going to give you, you've already essentially made a decision to start learning this. So we are going to give you 4 very specific ways that you can practice listening to your body and getting back in tune with those hunger and fullness cues. But I want to give you the affirmation that just because you're listening to this, you've already basically made that decision that, hey, this is probably really important for me. I should really start learning this again or get back in tune with my body. So take that, make it an actual decision, and then you can go implement these 4 ways to start getting in tune with your body again.
And the first step is awareness. We talk a lot about awareness because what you're starting to see is the pattern in place, right? So if you start to see that you're blowing past your fullness cues or you're not eating when you're hungry, that's a great place to build awareness and say, okay, this is telling me something about my current behavior. And it's really important. We might start building awareness around the emotions we eat from, right? Like if I feel bored or stressed and that drives me to food, that's a really good thing to pay attention to. It might be awareness around when I'm hungry or when I start to eat and I feel really full. But building that awareness is really important because it starts to tune us into what our natural pattern is, right? And from there, we get the opportunity to change. Now, here's the important thing of awareness. Awareness without a change. I'm going to cut this for a second. Now, here's the really important thing about awareness. Awareness without action to change doesn't lead us very far. So once we identify that something needs to change, it's really important that we practice changing it. And the only way to practice changing is to take a new action. And so that might be a small action, right? If you typically eat 5 slices of pizza, it might be having 4. And that's progress for you. That might be, hey, you know what? I really need to be disciplined right now. And I realize that I need to prep my food in the morning, or I need to have a healthy breakfast, or I need to start hydrating. Whatever it is that you feel like you need to do, from that awareness, we have to take action because just sitting there in awareness means that we're not changing, right? So from that point where we say, hey, this is the problem, I've identified it, start taking action and practice that and realize that that's what's actually getting you to where you want to be.
Yep, that's a really good point. Awareness is progress, but you have to then do something with that awareness in order to see physical change, right? To see your behavior change. So once we have awareness around maybe what our challenges are, how long we typically wait to eat, maybe even thinking on a scale of 1 to 10, when do I eat? Is it when I'm at an 11 out of 10 on the hunger scale? When do I stop eating? Is it when I'm at 11 out of 10 on the fullness scale, right? Those questions just build awareness. And then the second thing that we want to do to start actually shifting our behavior, once we have that awareness, is practice mindful eating. Mindful eating is a practice of paying full attention to your food. Think of this as like when people describe a yoga practice. They're getting on the mat, they're practicing the poses, they're practicing being present. Mindful eating is the practice of paying full attention to the food in front of you. We talked a lot about this in last week's episode. If you haven't seen that yet, definitely add that to your queue. It's how to lose weight without tracking your food. But the answer, spoiler alert, is to be able to mindfully eat and pay attention to what your body actually needs. So you can listen to a full in-depth episode on mindful eating in that previous episode. But for the sake of today, the intro I'll give you is that when you are mindfully eating, you are sitting down or standing with your food and you're trying to involve as many of your senses, your 5 senses, as possible when you are eating that meal. So you're trying to look at the meal, look at the different colors on the plate, try to smell it, right? What does it smell like when you eat it? Textures, tastes, flavors. I don't necessarily think you need to listen to how food sounds in your mouth because that would drive Brian crazy. But you can look at different textures and tastes and flavors, etc. Right? Mindful eating is just the practice of being fully present with your food, and it's something that we typically don't do. So if we can just start playing with that, even with like one meal or one snack a day, that is progress. Start practicing mindful eating. That is step number 2.
The third step is to practice meal planning in a mindful and healthy way. So I alluded to this earlier, but if you're someone who says, man, when I eat ice cream, I just feel like I can't stop, or when I eat sugar, it just kind of takes me away. It's like, well, what did you eat the rest of the day?
It's a good question.
Right? What did you eat the rest of the day? Because if you haven't eaten anything the rest of the day, your body is empty, right? You aren't going to reach that fullness point. So it's being able to understand that, hey, if I'm really reaching a point where I'm ravenous, very hungry, I'm probably not eating an adequate breakfast. I'm not having an adequate lunch.
Yeah.
I'm not putting the food that my body needs into it. And it's okay because we can start meal planning around that. So being able to say, hey, if I'm going to have a sweet at night, I need to make sure that I have a healthy dinner first.
Yep.
If I'm going to go out to dinner and I'm not really sure what's going to work for me, it's like, hey, how can I have a protein, healthy vegetable, and maybe a little bit of a healthy carbohydrate? It's being intentional with what we're putting in our body.
Or even look at the menu first.
Exactly. These are all little things that we can start to tune into, because that's actually what's going to allow us to not reach, like Lindsay said, I eat when I'm a 4 out of 10 when it comes to my hunger cue. That's a sign for her mentally to say, oh, I need to eat. But then she's not going and having pretzels.
Yeah.
She's having an intentional meal. And one of the things I find to be really helpful, I'll tie this down here, is the meal planning works well when we're also tuning into our goal, right? So it's asking, well, what's my goal and how can I effectively plan to hit it, right? And then ideally, we want to be, like, I think of a fullness cue. The ideal target is reaching the end of the day feeling like, man, I'm like a 8 out of 10 with my fullness. I could probably eat a little bit more, but I feel satisfied. I feel good. That's a really good cue that you're on the right path to what your body needs or where your goal is. So between the awareness, the mindful eating, and then meal planning, that's going to round us out to really start to cue in. But there is one more point I know you wanted to bring up that will help people to start practicing this.
Yes. The fourth point is to make sure that as you're going through this process and you're really learning your body's hunger cues, that you are really genuinely nice to yourself. That might sound cheesy, but here's what we typically do. We will say, I am going to learn this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to just do it. And then we try it and we aren't that good at it yet. And so instead of being kind to ourselves and saying, hey, we're going to get better. It's okay you overate. Or like, hey, okay, we waited too long to eat. All right. Instead of doing that, we say, what is wrong with you? Why can't you just do this? This is like Brian and Lindsay said, this is natural. Like, you should be able to already know your body's hunger cues. That is you judging yourself and being not nice to yourself. And it is really freaking hard to make changes that are positive from a place of judgment. So if you want to learn this and really learn it, fourth part of getting started is being kind to yourself. Mm-hmm. With that said, this is where we're going to end for today. So get started, start implementing some of these practices, and do us a favor. If you found this valuable, if you found it helpful, whether you are on YouTube or podcast, go ahead and subscribe. Especially if you are somebody who tends to listen to these episodes often, please make sure that you're subscribed, because not only will that make sure that you get the notification when we come out with a new episode, but that will also help us reach more people like you who really want to live a healthy, balanced life and who have just been struggling with it for years. So if that's really something that you've, again, found value from, we would appreciate if you'd subscribe. And of course, as always, we'd love to hear your takeaway. If you screenshot this and share it on your social media stories, tag Brian and I, and we'd love to hear what you took from this.
Now, lastly, we did a special masterclass about emotional eating last week, and we wanted to give it to you as a bonus. So if you are here, you can get the recording, you can get the masterclass, and it'll teach you everything you need to know in order to break your worst emotional eating habits. So we put the link to sign up in the comment section below in the actual show notes. So click there, you'll get the recording, and hopefully it helps you as you're kind of building awareness. We think it's really a fantastic little training and something that we saw a lot of people benefit from. So if you haven't seen it yet, love to add it your way. But on that note, thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us your time and attention. And now go out and conquer your day.
Cheers.
Cheers.